Okay, we might get going now. It's an absolute delight to welcome everybody online to this AVERT webinar. My name is Michelle Grossman. I am the co-convener of the AVERT Research Network. As we get going, I would like, first of all, not only to welcome everybody, but also to acknowledge the Indigenous owners and custodians of the land on which many of us are sited, wherever it is that we may be joining from. In my case, that is, I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, as well as to welcome and acknowledge any Indigenous people from anywhere in the world who may be joining us here today. So we're very excited to have John Morrison with us presenting today, and I'll introduce John and his topic in a moment. But first, just a couple of house rules. John will be speaking with us and giving his presentation for roughly half an hour. That will leave us a good period of time for Q&A. If you have questions to ask, and of course we hope you will have many questions to ask, we ask that you please put them in the Q&A tab that you should see at the bottom of your screen. Don't put them in the chat because it creates all sorts of technical issues. So please do use the Q&A function. On that note, now let me introduce Dr. John Morrison, Associate Professor John Morrison. John is Associate Professor of Criminology at Maynooth University in Ireland. He is co-editor-in-chief of the journal Behavioral Sciences of Terrorism and Political Aggression, which, as many people would know, is one of the absolute key journals in the field of terrorism and violent extremism research. With a multidisciplinary background, John's research interests include, amongst other things, organizational fragmentation, individual disengagement, and the role of trust in the psychology of terrorism. And indeed, John is going to be speaking to us today about the filtering role of trust in the process of disengagement. So welcome, John, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you to everyone at AVERT for the invite, especially Estelle as well, who's not here today, but who's done a lot of the prep and organizing. I'm just bear with me one sec. I'll share my screen and we can get started. So, some of you might be aware of my work before in relation to trust, and especially in relation to the role that trust plays in the disengagement process. The reason I say this is that this research that I'm going to present today stems from research that I did with my colleague Andrew Silk, my colleagues Heidi Myberg and others as well, back a few years ago in a CREST-sponsored project where we were looking at the individual disengagement and deradicalisation processes. And we saw and presented trust as a filtering process. What I'm going to do today is it's sort of update on that role of trust. When I got the invite to give this talk, I was thinking, oh, well, I've nothing new to present here. But then the more I thought about it, I was thinking about research project proposal that I'm getting together and some ideas that I'm getting together about the centrality that we need to have of the centrality of trust that we need to have within our research on terrorism broadly. So this is just a small piece of that broader proposal. So it is very much a work in progress at the moment and just some early thoughts at that stage. So as Michelle said, please do ask questions and provide comments because all that feedback will be really useful, really worthwhile for me as well. So when we're looking at this, we can look at trust from multiple different perspectives. Jeffrey Hosking back in 2009, in what I think is the seminal piece of work looking at trust within terrorism, he looked at the general role that trust plays. And he said in opening up his article, trust enables us to simplify and understand complicated realities and orientate ourselves in them, which we do through symbolic systems, including myth and religion. However, Terrorism results when these systems generate extreme distrust, especially between ethnic or religious groups. And he goes on to say that terrorism, one might say, is distrust squared. Indeed, distrust taken to its maximum degree. So, at the very heart of what people are trying to achieve through the utilization of terrorism is challenging the trust that we have within society, looking at getting us to distrust those others, those outgroups, those who we might have previously trusted. And we can see that at the moment just up the road from me in Northern Ireland, not necessarily in a terrorism related aspect, but in relation to current riots that have been going on over the past 2 days, where there is this far right protest, far right riot, where there's the burning of buses, the burning of houses, all off the back of a near fatal stabbing. And we see this the world over, time and time again, when we've got different acts of violence, different acts of violent rioting like this, and acts of terrorism. The purpose is to create that distrust. And much of the literature on terrorism to date, when looking at trust, has looked at it at this broad level. However, there has been some brilliant research that has been coming out that's been looking at it in a different way. It's been looking at it in a way that says not just about how the terrorists are trying to get those of us to distrust one another and to distrust other groups. It's looking also at the role that trust plays internally within terrorism as well. The trust that those involved in terrorism need to have and the impact that that can have. So while I'm going to be presenting on the role that trust and distrust can and does play within the disengagement process within today's lecture, within today's talk, we can easily talk about the role that trust plays in the lead up to someone becoming involved in terrorism, in the act of violent extremism and terrorism, and actually going out and carrying out attack and the trust that they need in others to engage in that. But then the trust across multiple different roles as well, the trust that a recruiter needs to have in those that they're recruiting. You can see that through the brilliant work of Thomas Heghammer, where he's looking at the signaling that goes on during the recruitment process. You can look at it, yes, within the disengagement that I'm going to look at today, and you can look at it in that reintegration point of view. So we need to take Hosking's starting point, yes, as we need to look at trust broadly and the role that trust plays in terrorism in general. But we need to become more focused as well. What role does trust play internally? And off the back of that as well, we can look at the role that trust needs to play by understanding the centrality of trust across these different processes within involvement in terrorism and moving away from terrorism. We need to understand the trust that needs to come into countering violent extremism. The role that trust needs to play within that reintegration process, the role that trust needs to play within countering terrorism. That it can't be that we are just taking this as an understanding of, well, trust is playing that internal role. We need to, with that understanding, see how this can impact the positivity, the successes of any approach that we take. So we need to understand how we can fit that in. So when we're looking at it, we need to use Hosking's work and others as a springboard into saying, well, how about the roles that trust and distrust play for the terrorists themselves? Because it's not just looking at the role that trust plays, that I am trusting of someone and therefore I will engage in this action. A lot of the decisions are made and a lot of the moves within terrorism, internally within terrorism and out of terrorism, can be made because of distrust as well. So the opportunities that distrust can provide in assisting the disengagement. So we can look at it from multiple different points of view. And what I'm going to talk about, and the way I frame it, and it's within the title of this talk itself, is I look at this as a filtering mechanism. And this filtering mechanism originates from that CREST project, where myself, Andrew Silk, Heidi Myberg, and others, we developed what was called the Phoenix model of disengagement. Whereas oftentimes we're looking at models of engagement, disengagement, radicalization, or so on, and we're looking at these different factors, these different variables that are involved, that influence these processes. And when we looked at the role of trust, we saw that trust was providing that filtering mechanism. Whereas that we cannot presume that when there are all those different variables in play, when there are all those different situations that are taking place for an individual within the context in which they find themselves, we cannot presume that that will automatically lead to them moving away from terrorism. Just because they no longer believe in what the group stands for or what the ideology is espousing does not necessarily mean that they will disengage. Just because they are disillusioned by what is going on within the broader movement and they don't believe in it anymore does not necessarily mean that they will disengage. Yes, that will play a part, but if they don't trust those individuals who are trying to assist that disengagement, if they don't believe that there is a safe way for them to maintain their exit from the group, they might stay within the group, even if they don't believe in anymore in what the group's doing. And we have seen examples where actually, even when they're no longer believing in what the group stands for, and but when they don't trust that they have a safe exit route, that they might actually become more violent to prove themselves once again within the group as well. So trust, the the lack of trust in those situations might keep people within the group because they don't see that trusted opportunity. So that filter of trust will differentiate between those likely to successfully disengage and reintegrate from those who will not. And I very purposely put that word successfully there. That there might be attempts, there might be the start of it, but without those trusting relationships, that they might go back in and engage with the groups as well. So traditionally, when you look at terrorism and at disengagement from terrorism, you've seen brilliant work by people like John Horgan, Mary Beth Altier, Kurt Braddock, and others who are looking at those push-pull factors, those aspects internally within an individual's involvement in terrorism, which is pushing them away to disengage, saying that disillusionment, what the group stands for, disillusionment with the ideology or any strategic or tactical choices that are being made, that are pushing them away. But there's also those pull factors, those things external from involvement within terrorism, which is drawing someone away, those positive relationships that they might have with family members, friends. And I, as you can see, my daughter is getting ready for school at the moment. So apologies for that disturbance. So we we need to be able so those pull factors are there, those people and others, those positive opportunities drawing them away. It might be employment, it might be the start of a family and so on. But when we're looking at those push and pull factors, we can look at them through that lens of trust as well. Those push factors of disillusionment and others might also be framed as a deterioration in internal trust, that they're no longer trusting maybe the ideology to achieve those end goals which they're looking to achieve. They're no longer trusting the individuals within the group. They're no longer trusting the tactics or strategies that are being utilized. But those pull factors may be framing trust in a more positive way. It might be the accentuation of external trust, where those relationships that they have distanced themselves from before they might be drawn back in and they might be trusting those individuals more, those families, those friends. Or there might be new relationships formed with those who are looking to assist, those formers potentially who are looking to assist in drawing them out. And you can see brilliant work being done by Gordon Clubb in the University of Leeds, where he's looking at that role of formers alongside Mary Beth Altier and others, looking at those roles of formers and the trust that is needed for them to be able to draw people out. So we can reframe those traditional literature to look at that role there. So this is what the Phoenix model was. We were looking at the identification. We identified environmental catalysts, psychological catalysts, and those actor catalysts, whether they be family and friends, formers, program interventions, or others, and saying, yes, the presence of all of these are really important. However, if they are not trusted, this will not be successful. So what we were proposing from that original research is we need to be able to design trust in, to build trust into any program that we have, to spend as much time in developing those trusting relationships as we do in developing the content of any program intervention that there might be. Cannot presume necessarily that a former is going to be automatically trusted. By dint of who they are, they might be seen as traitors to the groups as well. So we need to be able to acknowledge and identify, well, who might the most trusted people be and when? Because this is not just an event, this is a process as well. So there might be different trusting relationships that are needed at different stages of involvement. So at that initial disengagement, actually, we were finding that family and friends were not going to be the most trusted. That it might be those formers, it might be those who are involved in the program interventions. But in order to maintain the disengagement and to maintain the reintegration, the family and friends then step in that maintenance capacity, and that's where they need to be more trusted as well. So that's where we were, and what I want to do is to really look at where things have come since then. And I came across, I think this is a paper here that I feel that I really wanted to write myself. And when I saw it written, I was delighted. This research done within Australia of trust building in CVE programs, a Muslim youth perspective. This really emphasizes what we were trying to say here. They look at the need for trust building within CVE, but not taking it from the perspective of those who are those program interventions. They are looking at it from a Muslim youth perspective and emphasizing that need to know, and I've used the word audience here, it's not a word that's used within the article, but needing to know who are the most important people here? Who are the people who are most likely to be from the communities who are targeted by these CVE interventions? And they looked at one community here, one of many communities who will be necessary to understand their trusting relationships, and that's the Muslim youth perspective here. And what they found is that while there can be trust in individual CVE workers, there may be wider distrust of policing organisation and the policing organisation and or the government. So we need to integrate not just that understanding of trust within the individuals, but those broader levels of trust and distrust that Hosking was talking about earlier on. So they're talking about that when we're looking at the successes in CVE, it's about trust building through community engagement and broader societal issues. That element of trust that we're looking for cannot just be developed at that point of intervention and within one-on-one individual levels. That while we can have those individual levels of trust, without those broader societal issues being tackled and those issues around distrust, we will not be as successful as we could be. So at the end of the article, a really useful suggestion is that there needed to be Muslim youth involvement in the designing of CVE programs. That we need to be able to draw on that expertise and draw on that cultural awareness of what way we can assist in developing trust, in able to assist in making the most successful programs that are there. And from this as well, we need to be able to take an interdisciplinary perspective and be able to look at analogous areas of analysis while we are developing out that broader understanding of trust. Because while we have people like Hoskins and while we have the work of Al Hamadine and others looking at trust, Thomas Heghammer, others like that as well, it is still an under-researched area. And we cannot have it that we're looking at this from, well, we're going to have to reinvent the wheel. There has been so much work that has been done across multiple different disciplines, across multiple different analogous areas, where we can draw on the analysis that others have had to assist us in developing out that understanding of trust, to assist us in trying to find out the best approaches that we can have. So this is what I've been doing over the past few months as I've been getting this research proposal together. Is alongside my colleague Sydney Sheridan, we've been looking at multiple different analogous areas to try and draw from previous expertise with nothing to do with terrorism and the role that trust can play. Now, we have those obvious examples that we often compare to where we're looking at trust in relation, terrorism in comparison to political organizations, terrorism in comparison to organized crime in the military. But we're also looking at it similar to what Lauren Dawson had done before, looking at it in comparison to new religious movements, in comparison to cults, but also in comparison to businesses. And when you look at the role of trust within research and business, it is vast. It is huge. And you might think, well, what's the point? That's so different. But if you go back to what Horgan and Taylor have said, and that terrorists are ordinary people making decisions in the context in which they find themselves, we can draw on these areas of other situations of ordinary people making decisions in the context in which they find themselves, how others build their relationships, how others build trusting relationships as well. But we also want to look at the work of influencers and how influencers get their trust and develop trust. Because so much of what we're seeing at the moment is happening online. And so many of the people being drawn in are being affected by terrorist-related influencers, really. But also from a disengagement point of view, that can have an impact as well. That online presence is going to be there across all those different stages. So when we're looking at it, this is just a snapshot of some of the core analogous findings that we have. And when we look at the military, when we look at trust internally within the military, there's a differentiation of trust in leadership based on a combination of leadership approaches and cadets' levels of experience. So this is telling us here that when we're looking at trust, we cannot be looking at it in a homogenous way. We've for so long been saying we cannot look at the terrorist as a homogenous individual. We need to be able to look at those different roles and so on. When we're looking at trust as well, we cannot look at it in a homogenous way as well. We need to take into account the levels of experiences that those cadets might have in and how that will impact their views of the leadership. We need to look at the different leadership approaches that are being taken as well. We need to look at it in terms of the type of training that's been given. We need to look at it in terms of the type of instruction that's been given. We need to look at how forceful the leadership are in terms of the cadets. So finding those combinations, those temporal aspects of the time that a person has been involved, the expertise, that expert versus novice difference, will affect the way, the role that trust can play as well. When you look at organized crime as well, you look at from Giovanni Travaglino and others, found that trust in institutions. So though looking at that broader aspect, similar to what Hosking was saying, we are seeing similar findings within organized crime. Trust in institutions is lower in areas where there is a stronger influence of criminal groups and where state resilience is weaker. So it's saying to us we need to have that geographical understanding that trust is going to be different at different at different levels, at different places. Trust is going to be affected in different ways depending on the influence of the groups within specific areas. When you look at those new religious movements, it's pointed to as something quite interesting. The work of Harding and colleagues in 2022 is saying that prior membership of a cult was having an impact on willingness to trust healthcare professionals. So that trust is not just playing a part throughout the process of involvement within the cult, but it's also having an impact in the process of what happens afterwards. That reintegration, that engagement in a normal life afterwards as well. So that prior membership can have an impact on future trusting relationships and future trust. Within businesses, it says that we need to understand cross-cultural trust building processes, including both similarities and differences to our own cultural trust building processes as well. So that need to understand that there are different ways of gaining and maintaining trust across cultures. And within the influencers, it's talking about that similarity of the influencers, the procedural fairness of the influencers, the interpersonal fairness and attractiveness, strengthens the parasocial relationships, strengthens the levels of trust. Those similarities, being able to compare oneself to the others, will influence whether you're going to be drawn towards what they're saying, what they're trying to influence you on. So all of these findings, while they're from different areas, you can see how they're analogous to within terrorism. You can see, obviously, within organized crime, if there is a movement or a group or an ideology which is strong within a particular area, you might see it harder for institutions to maintain and gain trust. You can see in that comparison to military that if you can put that forward as a terrorist leader, that dependent on the experience levels of those new recruits and the approaches that the leadership take, that trust can have a role there as well. If you look at those who've disengaged from those new religious movements, that the impact of actually their involvement can have an impact on their trusting relationships afterwards. You can see that as analogous to someone who is disengaged as well. Emily Corners and Paul Gill and others have talked for so long and brilliantly on the impact that involvement in terrorism can have on one's mental health. That it's not always going to be that we need to look at mental health at the beginning of or prior to one's involvement in terrorism. It can change and be influenced by one's involvement. And similarly, trust can and our trusting relationships can be impacted by our involvement as well. So we need to look at its changes across time as well. But one of the things that stood out to me that we need to develop more, and we need to develop all of this more, is this understanding of cross-cultural trust building processes. And this is something that my colleague Sidney Sheridan particularly pointed out from our engagement in the literature, is that need to understand cross-cultural trust building processes. And we need to be able to have that comparison. At the end of that Al Hamadine and colleagues article, they have a really important note that when we're looking at that Muslim youth community, they acknowledge that this is not a homogenous community. There are multiple different communities within that. And even when we're looking at what might on the outset look like one community, we need to be able to be aware of those cross-cultural comparisons internally. But we need to be aware outside of that as well. We need to be aware of the contexts and cultures that can influence trust building processes. That cross-cultural understanding of perception of roles, ideology, behavior, language, etc. So we need to take that time to understand and engage with the communities who we are looking at here, to understand the role that trust plays internally for them within their groups, within their communities. And that can also then influence the CVE process. That can influence countering violent extremism. because there are different processes across different communities, across different cultures to gain and maintain trust. When you look at businesses, for example, we came across multiple, and these are just a few examples of multiple different approaches, processes, rituals, etc., in order to gain and maintain trust. Whether it's Guangxi, Mazel ritual, Sam handling in Norway, Et Moon, Blatt in Russia, and others as well. And these different processes, to understand them within business, assist people in being able to be successful in their business transactions cross-culturally. So if business research has identified this, we need to be able to say, well, are we seeing similar here? Are we seeing similar within for terrorism? Are we seeing similar that might influence countering violent extremism? And that's one of the things that I'm proposing to look at. That now, I'm not saying that it's going to be these same processes, because of these processes that are listed as examples here, a lot of them are linked to negotiations, business negotiations, and so on. But we might see similar differences. We might see other differences across cultures within the areas that are most important to us during these processes. And within that as well, because CVE is understandably and rightfully involving multi-agency partners, this cannot be just looking cross-culturally at different countries, religions, and so on. We need to look at the cultures within the agencies that are involved in CVE process in order to have those most successful multi-agency approaches. We need to be able to have that multi-agency understanding of the differences in trust building initiatives as well. So that's where I'm going with this research. And obviously, this is really at a starting point at a proposal level, and it's only a small part of the broader research that I'm looking at. But I want to return to something that Russell Harden said in 2002. If I generally distrust people, I will discover little about their actual trustworthiness because I will choose not to interact with them. It follows that I will have to make choices with less information to go on than others, than other more optimistic people have. If we are seeing someone who we want to engage in the disengagement process, who is not trusting of those program providers, those formers, or those family and friend members who are trying to assist them, they are closing themselves off to that information being provided. Even if we have the best programs designed, if they are not trusting, they are going to be blinkered and they are not going to be influenced by that. They're not going to be influenced by what others are saying and the opportunities others are providing. And they are going to still be influenced by those internally within their movement and groups and are more likely to stay involved. So it's not just about those personal relationships. It's about providing access to the information about the opportunities, the information about alternative viewpoints as well. So we need to be able to look at the role of trust in that way. And we need to work on building trust broadly within communities and building trust within interpersonal relationships and taking our time at it, not just looking at building it at that last minute, because it is easy to lose trust, but it is not as easy to regain it. So we need to be very conscious of all of this throughout. I'm going to leave it there for now. Thank you for your patience with that, and I hope that you've got a few questions for me as well and some things for me to think about. And please do keep in touch. Feel free to email me at john.morrison@mu.ie, and even just to tell me that what I'm saying is all rubbish, that's absolutely fine as well. Or to point me towards other literature that you might think would be useful for this project. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much, John. That was fantastic. I've got 1,000 questions already that I would like to put to you. But I think that we've got and as people are gathering their thoughts, we've already got one question in the Q&A, but I might also come to some of the questions that I have in the interim. So this person is asking, I would characterize this, or, all right, actually, I won't characterize it, I'll just say it. How
Yeah.
can government-based CVE programs create and maintain credibility and trust, not only with Muslim, but other communities, when broader government and policing actions, policies, and discourse contribute to perceptions of marginalization or distrust? So, I mean, for me, that question is about CVE is part of a much broader ecology, of
Yeah.
systems, of agencies, of relationships. How can it try to do the trust work when the broader ecology in which it sits, is posing challenges to that?
Yeah, and this is one of the biggest challenges that's out there because when we did that original Phoenix model research, we found that the most successful at building trusting relationships are those non-governmental organizations who approach CVE. It's it is challenging. It's about centering human rights at the heart of everything that's done as well, about justifying the decisions that are made and engaging in open, transparent, and critical dialogue within communities, not just at that point of crisis. Because a lot of the problem is reactionary. It's that your government and policing organizations and others might be seen as, okay, well, we've had an attack here, we've had a surge in recruitment, we've had targeting of a community, so we're going to look at engaging now and be visible now. It's maintaining that visibility and that engagement in the community at times where there
Hmm.
isn't crisis there. Community policing is something that is coming up time
Yes,
and time again.
I was just
And
going to
the
mention that.
importance of that is huge. It's what often previously in the police was seen as a starting point, and then you get promoted to something a bit more advanced. But actually, it's the bedrock of policing there as representation of the state as well. So, but
Hmm.
it's about showing that normality of the approaches, but having that ability to listen and to be critiqued as well. So it's opening up conversation, but engaging at times
Hmm.
where it is in
Hmm.
crisis. But it's going to be huge. It is hugely difficult, and that's why there needs to be
Yeah.
involvement, not just from governmental and state bodies. There needs to be
Hmm.
non-governmental organizations as well who are involved, who are much more able and much more credibly able to criticize the state
Hmm.
as well.
Hmm.
So that would be the
Thank you.
approach, what I'd suggest.
So one question, there are a couple of other questions, but
Yeah,
I'll insert my own question here at this point because it follows on, I think, nicely from what you've just said. Trust relations, it's not really possible, I don't think, to talk about trust relations without also talking about risk,
yeah,
right? Trust is risky business.
yeah.
And particularly in the beginning stages of deciding whether you're going to trust somebody, it is, as the literature will tell us, a bit of a gamble. I think it was Mullering who said, trust really is the favorable expectation that somebody is gonna help you and not harm you, right? That's
Hmm.
really
Yeah,
what it boils down to. But it is also the case that trust relations involve what you might call the revealing of mutual vulnerability. So
yeah,
when you trust anybody else, whether it's another individual or a system, you are making yourself vulnerable because you don't
yeah,
know whether you're going to be supported or whether you're going to be harmed.
yeah.
The key to, if reciprocity in trust relations is a bedrock element, which we know from a lot of the literature that it is, then mutual vulnerability is another kind of
Mm,
bedrock requirement. Now, so the question that I have is the expectation in community government relationships in
mhm.
CVE is often that the community should be comfortable with its vulnerability, right?
Yeah.
But how comfortable is government being vulnerable in a trust relationship? And if there are barriers, as I think we might agree that we can think of several barriers to
Yeah.
government agencies or government personnel being able to display vulnerability, what are the
Mhm.
implications of that from your point of view?
I think I'm going to need a longer presentation for that, answering that question. I think you've hit on really I thi- in the setup to that question, you've hit on one of the most important things, that vulnerability of trust. And that's what Heckhammer talks about at the recruitment stage, that it's a vulnerable stage when you're trying to look at those signals in developing trust on both sides. It's the recruit as well as the recruiter. But within the government versus community level trust, that vulnerability, yes, it's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity.
Mm,
It's an opportunity there because if there is a situation where you're seeing the government and the governmental representatives displaying legitimate vulnerability there, their willingness to be vulnerable, that will assist in that development of trust. That will assist in them saying, okay, the community saying, okay, they're taking a journey with us, they're listening as well, and
mm.
they're willing to be challenged. But governments are often very fearful of that. We've seen that in the UK with relationships being built and then once exposed, distancing of those relationships as well. So it's a question I'm going to need to think about a bit more.
Okay,
It's something that I'll definitely build in, but yeah, I'd need to think about it a bit more from a practical point of view, the
fair
way
enough.
of
It's a
embedding
tough one.
that vulnerability. I'm
Yeah.
glad that wasn't in my Viva now, Michelle.
No worries at all. But
Mm,
I agree with you that it's something that we do need to think about
yeah,
very much from a practical, operational
yeah.
point of view. Okay, so we've got some terrific questions coming online in the Q&A. This is from a person who says they've done some work on organizational power dynamics and culture. And one of their findings was that the concentration of power more or less kills trust entirely.
Okay.
The question for you, coming off that, is how does power feature and interplay in the Phoenix model? Where does it
So
fit?
it fits within that trust element for sure. It's something that hasn't been expanded within it, but it has been intimated within it, and that's something that we would look to. We're looking to update the Phoenix model. What we see in the Phoenix model is the first stage of it, and we're looking to update it as we're getting more data and more literature. But that goes back to that point that I was raising about the military as well. That those leadership roles and the power dynamics are built within those as well, and that can affect those trusting relationships. But what is being suggested within the Phoenix model is that individual this is about individual disengagement and the role of the individual there, and we need to take into account that context from which they are, and part of the context of that is understanding the influence that the power dynamics internally within their current reality will does have. So it's taking that time to understand the influence that those power dynamics might have currently for them and seeing how that can be built into a CVE process. But it is definitely a challenge, but it's a challenge that needs to be acknowledged because if we don't acknowledge it, we lose that opportunity as well. If we don't acknowledge their context, they will lose that opportunity for trust and will lose that opportunity for them becoming
Mm,
involved with
mm,
and staying involved in the process as
yes.
well. So it's building that across a long period of time, building that understanding and looking to shift that power dynamic by one of the things you'll see with the underlying, and something I didn't mention within the model, is underlying it all is about identity transformation. So it's about that during that process of identity transformation, it's seeing if those power dynamics can shift where they're with a new identity of as a disengaged individual or someone who's becoming disengaged, whether those power dynamics might be having less of an
Mm,
influence on them as
interesting.
well. Yeah.
Mm, terrific. Thank you. Okay, the next question asks, do you envision us being able to build trust one-to-one in a CVE intervention and then using that as a connection tool to commence building trust with other agencies? So if that is a realistic approach, what steps or process might you recommend?
Yeah, so it is going on. That building of trust one to one within CV, it is going on the world over. And it's not getting highlighted as much as the focus within it. So there's some excellent practitioners there building that one to one trust. But that connection, that multi-agency connection, as a result of that, the more that these one-to-one relationships can be built and evidenced as well, we need to be able to
Mm,
show the evidence of that. We need to be able to show the successes of that. That will lessen any multi-agency distrust. That will lessen any distrust
mm.
that might be there in engaging with other
Uh,
organizations, being able to demonstrate that success in trust building.
So just as a follow on before I come to the next couple of questions, is something really interesting that we found when we did that project I was
Yeah.
telling you about earlier on whether governments trust communities
Mm,
in CVE contexts and how that plays out. One of the things that our participants really highlighted was the problem of churn in different
yeah.
agencies. Okay, so they were like,
Yeah.
great, we go ahead and we develop these trusting relationships, say, with people in a particular area of policing or in a particular intervention program, perhaps that's run by another agency. But so what, they said, because
Yeah.
then that person leaves or
Yeah.
they get rotated out of that unit.
Yeah.
And then we feel like we have to start all over
Mhm.
again. So, what is your view on how to sort of manage the kind of gap that you get between the interpersonal layer of
Yeah.
trust, which is so important, but being able to sustain some kind of organizational or systemic trust that helps account for the movement at the interpersonal
Yeah.
level that we know is a reality of the field.
Yeah. And it is a reality. And like to start off, I want to take a step back first and like commend the work that you've all done as well. Like so often the onus is put on the communities to trust the government, but we need to be able to look at it both ways as well. So it is really important to have that research that's been done. But what you're identifying is absolutely a challenge, and I point back to what that research, the Hamadine and colleagues' research, that there needs to be that involvement of the community within design of the processes as well, and within the approaches that are being taken and being able to be transparency is going to be key throughout. Transparency of who the individual, why there is this churn that's going on, the reality of that, but how the communities are leading that integration of. We often talk about the integration of those people leaving, but we need to talk about the integration of those people who are the practitioners as well, those integrations within the community, that the community are able to lead that as well and to be able to take a clear role within designing of how there is that integration there.
Mm,
So
mm,
it's by giving them ownership of the process as well, will establish and help to maintain that trust as well. So it's it's not simple, but it's we need to start from simplistic ideas of it can't be just the CV practitioners saying, well, this is the way it's going to be, and this is who's going to be doing it. It's about listening and understanding from that community perspective on what they need and what
mm,
is going to be successful for them and allow them to lead it and to be influenced by them and to be able to demonstrate how these approaches may have changed as a result of their
mm,
interventions as well. That transparency, that clear ownership across the process will assist in the development
mm,
and the maintenance of trust as
mm.
well.
And I think also critically that your response is reminding all of us that trust is also a negotiation. It's never, it's a negotiation between parties, and that it is through that kind of negotiation actually that trust can be built and maintained. We
Yeah.
have another question that asks whether you have come across any good measures of how you might quantify trust. Is there a threshold that's reached that says, bing, trust has
Yeah.
been achieved? Um, and, this person is just thinking about how that might be put into practice in a measurement and evaluation framework, which, as we know, is such an important area for understanding the efficacy and helping ensure the continuity of those CVE
Yeah.
programs we know that are actually working well.
Yeah, within those analogous areas, there are multiple different measures that are out there. Now they would need to be developed to for this appropriate situation to be appropriate for this situation. However, while we might have these measures and might develop a quantitative approach, we need to be wary of them as well.
Mm,
We need to be, especially when it comes to trust building, as we're seeing across this, there's different factors that will influence different individuals as well, and that will influence different communities as well. So if we've got cross-cultural differences in trust building processes, one generic quantified approach to measuring trust mightn't necessarily be applicable within different communities and at different stages as well, because the role that trust plays at different stages is going to be different, and the role
mm,
of who those trusting relationships are going to be with are going to be different. So yes, there are measures externally that can be developed and made applicable here, but we need to be conscious of the cross-cultural context and that temporal context of at what stage we're looking in as
mm,
well. And there constantly needs to be that reevaluation of trust off the back of that, that
mm.
that trusting individual and trusting relationship that was so important at one stage mightn't be as important later on. And that it might be
Yes.
other trusting relationships that will
You're,
be.
you're, you're, you're reminding me of the experience of the PhD supervisor where we're all important to that doctoral student at the beginning, and by the end they're
Yeah,
like, I don't really need you anymore.
yeah,
Goodbye.
exactly.
Which is exactly what you want.
Exactly.
On the question of identity transformation,
Yeah,
you've raised something really interesting for me, which is as somebody's identity does transform, as they are realigning and repositioning their understanding of who they are. To what extent does that raise issues about what I would call self-trust? In other
yeah,
words, that you get to a point where you say, I can see that I'm changing. I can
yeah,
feel that I'm changing. Do I really trust this new me?
yeah.
Do I trust myself? And what impact do you think perhaps that period or phase of self-doubt as the transition into another kind of identity is taking place, which, as we know, is so vital in
Yeah.
disengagement processes. What implications does the phase of self-doubt or a
Mm.
wobble in self-trust have for trust relations with others as part of the disengagement landscape?
It's got a huge factor. I'm delighted you raised this as well because so often when we're looking at trust, we're looking at trust between individuals rather than trust in oneself. And you're at a stage of identity transformation. You're at a most vulnerable stage as well because it's not just a one day you wake up and your identity is different. It's a long process as well that has bumps along the road as well. And there is a lot of doubt across that. And if one can't trust themselves and trust who they are, that stage of vulnerability, when you look at the broader radicalization literature as well, they it that is saying that those people at those most vulnerable stages are those most likely to join. So there is actually during that identity transformation that growing likelihood of someone re-engaging as well. So there has to be that acknowledgement of that and providing people with the skills of self-analysis as well to be able to
Mm,
identify uh, what these vulnerabilities are and how to be able to manage it. That is a key part across CV is about not leading someone across that identity transformation, but supporting them within that identity transformation, providing them with the skills and opportunities to cope with that outside of the reality that they will have been involved in for years, and to be able through the use of formers and others to be able to have others who say, I went through the same and this is how I got through it. It might be different for you, but these are the tools that I utilize. And
So that's, mm. I was going to say that's another dimension of trust. We've only got a couple of minutes left, but we don't have any more questions on the list. So I
no,
might take advantage of being the chair to just ask you to reflect on this one further point. Because what you've just said really touches on the issue of trust and authenticity.
yeah,
Yeah. Trust and credibility. So, for anybody working in who's not a former, for example,
yeah,
or hasn't been on that side of the fence, issues around authenticity and credibility are paramount. What advice would you give to practitioners, and indeed to policymakers, about ways to manage those issues around authenticity and credibility when you are trying to build trust and confidence, for example, in a support system, an
yeah.
intervention program, and the like?
It's not to presume authenticity and credibility by person by dint of their experience. It's by always taking into account the perspective of the individual who is there that you're looking to try and support. That just so Douglas Week had an article a number of years back where he was saying that, and I know I've referred to formers here a bit, but saying just because someone is a former does not necessarily mean that they would be seen as a credible or authentic source. So that we need to be able to be reflective of who is seen as authentic and who is seen as credible within that context and for that individual at the time. And to have that willingness to constantly reflect on that across those different stages. And sometimes it might be that individual who didn't have any involvement before, but is coming at it from a perspective where they're seen to be authentically and credibly trying to engage and understand an
Mm,
individual's process. And they can come from multiple different community leaders. It could be someone who would be well known from sports clubs or might be involved in other ways within communities or outside of communities as well. If there is that transparency and credibility, that if there's that transparency of why they're involved and what they're trying to achieve and what they're bringing to this role, it's not going to be just, well, I had the same experience back in the 1980s, so we're the same. That person
mm,
might be seen as completely alien. That my
mm,
experience might be seen as, well, you don't know what it's like to be involved now. You might be pushing forward that, well, in my day it was like this, and that can get a lot more pushback. Whereas if it's someone who's there who's potentially looking to listen and to understand and to learn from the individual as well, to learn from their experience and not to just be straight away going, well, this is the way it is, and this is the way it was for me, and therefore these are the skills I use. It's trying to develop it together as
yeah.
well and to develop those relationships together. That will more likely to lead to a successful relationship and a successful, credible, and authentic relationship,
Mm,
but to
mm,
reflect on it across the different stages, that relationship might no longer be seen authentic or credible, and you might need someone else to step in, and that could be a family member, a friend, to in order
mm,
to maintain that
mm,
disengagement at different stages. It's
yeah.
that constant reflection and not just presuming credibility by dint of
Mm.
experience
Yeah,
as well.
I love that. I love that point that sometimes your credibility comes from being willing to be naive rather than having
Yeah,
to say I am the be all know all on
exactly.
this subject matter. John, we've come to the end, regrettably, I have to say, because I think we could have continued this conversation and taken on board a couple of more questions, but unfortunately we are out of time. I really do want to thank you very sincerely for a wonderful webinar. If I can just close by reminding people, first of all, if you're interested in the work that we do at AVERT and the various webinars that we have, almost all of which get recorded and put on our website, including John's. in short order. You can follow us on LinkedIn. We also have a YouTube channel where the recordings appear. I also wanted to let people know that our next webinar will be later this month on the 24th of June. We will have Dr. J.M. Berger, who will be known to many of you, of course, as one of the world's leading experts on extremism. And JM will be joining us to deliver a presentation titled From the Fringe to the Center, the Differing Radicalization Strategies of Extremist In-Groups When They Are Weak versus when they are strong. Everything that J.M. Berger does is always riveting and highly original. So we're really looking forward to that. And of course, you can jump onto the AVERT website if you're not already on our mailing list to find out what we're doing and be apprised of webinars and other events and resources as they come up. So thank you once again, John. Thank you to everybody for being here, and have a good morning, a good afternoon, or a good evening, wherever it is that you are in the world. Take care.
Thank you all. Thanks, Michelle.
Bye now.
Bye.